A starving dog appears on a snowy bridge, her golden fur matted and her eyes pleading for help. Behind her, hidden in the freezing cold, are 4 tiny puppies, shivering and clinging to life. But what happens when she crosses paths with a broken soldier standing on that same bridge? Will this chance encounter bring redemption for both? Stay with us to uncover their extraordinary journey of hope, healing, and second chances. James stood on the edge of the icy bridge, his breath coming in uneven puffs, visible in the frosty air. The world around him was silent, save for the occasional whistle of the winter wind. Snow blanketed the ground, and the rushing water below seemed to echo the chaos inside his mind. He tightened his grip on the rail, leaning forward slightly as he stared into the dark depths. This bridge had become his final refuge, a place where he could escape the unrelenting torment of his thoughts. James was no stranger to darkness. It had followed him home from Iraq, clinging to him like a shadow that refused to fade. He had once been a hero, lauded for his bravery and hailed as an example of selflessness. In the blistering heat of the Middle East, James had saved lives, many of them. He remembered the day that earned him a medal, though it brought him no pride. His convoy had been ambushed on a remote desert road. The Humvee in front of his had been hit by an IED, erupting into a ball of fire. Without hesitation, James had leapt from his vehicle and charged towards the wreckage, ignoring the bullets whizzing past him. He dragged the driver out of the burning vehicle and shielded another injured soldier with his own body as they crawled to cover. His actions had saved their lives, but they came at a cost. Shrapnel tore into his shoulder, leaving a jagged scar that still ached on cold days like this. The physical wounds healed with time, but the memories did not. The smell of burning metal, the screams of his comrades, and the haunting faces of those he couldn't save followed him everywhere. When James returned home, the reception was warm, almost jubilant. Friends and neighbors called him a hero. His wife, Rachel, embraced him at the airport with tears in her eyes. But as the weeks turned into months, the cracks began to show. James couldn't sleep. His nights were filled with nightmares so vivid that he would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding as if he were back on the battlefield. He avoided loud noises, crowded places, even family gatherings, because they made his skin crawl. The once outgoing man who loved barbecues and Sunday football games had retreated into himself, a hollow shell of who he used to be. Rachel tried to help at first. She encouraged him to talk about his experiences, to open up about the pain he was carrying. But James couldn't. He didn't have the words to describe the weight pressing down on him. He didn't want to burden her with the horrors he had seen or the guilt that consumed him. Instead, he shut her out. He stopped joining her for meals, stopped laughing at her jokes, stopped holding her hand. Arguments became a regular occurrence. Rachel begged him to seek therapy, but James refused, his pride and fear holding him back. "I'm fine," he would say, though they both knew it was a lie. One evening, after yet another fight, Rachel left a note on the kitchen counter. It was short, but devastating. "I can't do this anymore. I love you, but I can't watch you destroy yourself." James found the note the next morning. By then, Rachel was gone, taking the dog they had adopted together and leaving behind the empty shell of their marriage. The loneliness that followed was suffocating. Without Rachel, without the structure and camaraderie of the military, James felt unmoored. He tried to find work, but nothing seemed to fit. Civilians didn't understand him, and he didn't know how to bridge the gap. Small talk felt trivial, the complaints of co-workers petty. He couldn't explain why he flinched at the sound of a car backfiring or why he avoided the cheerful clamor of children playing in the park. He tried to fill the void with alcohol, spending long nights at the local bar. For a while, the numbness it brought was a relief, but it never lasted. The memories always returned, sharper and more painful than before. As the years passed, James withdrew further into himself. The house he and Rachel had once decorated together became cluttered and neglected. The walls seemed to close in on him, each corner a reminder of what he had lost. Tonight, standing on the bridge, James felt the weight of it all crushing him. The snow beneath his boots crunched softly as he shifted his stance. His fingers gripped the icy rail tighter, the cold biting into his skin. Would anyone even notice if he disappeared? Would they care? The thought of Rachel's face flashed in his mind, her warm smile, her gentle laugh. But the memory quickly twisted into the hurt in her eyes during their last fight, the way she had looked at him as if he were a stranger. James closed his eyes, shaking his head. The sound of a soft whimper broke through the silence. James opened his eyes, startled. He turned his head and saw a dog standing a few feet away. It was a golden retriever, though its fur was dirty and matted, its ribs visible beneath its thin coat. Its large, soulful eyes stared at him, filled with an intensity that he couldn't ignore. "What are you doing here?" James muttered, his voice low and rough. The dog whined again, taking a cautious step forward. It stopped, its tail wagging slightly as if trying to reassure him. James frowned, his despair momentarily interrupted by curiosity. The dog's gaze didn't waver. It looked over its shoulder, then back at him, as if urging him to follow. James let out a shaky breath, his grip on the rail loosening. He stepped back from the edge, his boots crunching in the snow. "All right," he said softly. "Show me what you want." The dog turned and began to walk toward the forest at the far end of the bridge. Every few steps, it glanced back to make sure James was following. James hesitated, glancing back at the icy water below. Then he turned and followed the dog into the trees, his heart beating faster, though he didn't know why. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something other than despair. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps it was purpose, or perhaps it was the faintest whisper of hope. James trudged after the golden retriever, his boots crunching against the snow-covered ground as he followed its purposeful strides into the forest. The cold bit at his exposed skin, but he barely noticed. His mind churned with thoughts of the strange turn his night had taken. He had come to the bridge to end everything, but here he was, following a stray dog into the unknown. The dog, thin and fragile yet moving with determination, paused occasionally to glance back at him. Its eyes held an urgency that James couldn't ignore. Something about the dog's demeanor stirred a long-forgotten instinct in him, a sense of responsibility. As the trees grew denser, James noticed how silent the forest was. The dog led him to a clearing where a fallen tree rested, its roots forming a shallow hollow. The dog stepped carefully into the hollow and began nudging something with her nose. James squinted, stepping closer, and his breath caught. 4 tiny puppies, barely the size of his hand, lay huddled together, shivering in the frigid air. Their fur was thin, their tiny bodies pressed against each other for warmth. The mother dog, this emaciated creature that had led him here, lay down beside them, wrapping her frail body around the pups in an attempt to shield them from the cold. James knelt, his knees sinking into the snow. "Oh, girl," he murmured, his voice catching in his throat. The mother dog looked up at him, her eyes a mix of exhaustion and hope. She nudged one of the puppies closer to her with her nose, as if to say, "Please help us." James reached out slowly, his large, calloused hand trembling as he touched the nearest puppy. Its tiny body was cold, its breathing shallow. A pang of protectiveness surged through him, catching him off guard. He glanced at the mother dog again. "You've done everything you can, haven't you?" he said softly. "But you can't do this alone." The dog didn't move, as if she understood his words. James gently scooped up the puppies one by one, tucking them into the warmth of his jacket. The mother dog stood and pressed herself close to his side, her trust evident in the way she leaned against him. As James stood, cradling the puppies and guiding the mother dog back toward the bridge, his thoughts drifted to a time when compassion came more naturally to him, when he and Rachel had once cared for a dog of their own. Rachel, had always loved animals. Shortly after they were married, she convinced James to adopt a Labrador Retriever puppy from the local shelter. They named her Sadie, and she quickly became the center of their little world. Rachel had a way with Sadie, a patience and gentleness that James admired. She would spend hours teaching the dog tricks, brushing her coat until it gleamed, and baking special dog treats in the kitchen. Sadie brought out a soft side in James, too. He would play fetch with her after long days at work, her joyful barks filling their small backyard with life. When James deployed to Iraq, Rachel wrote to him about Sadie in every letter. She sent pictures of the dog curled up on their couch or chasing birds in the yard. "She misses you," Rachel would write. "We both do." Sadie had been there when James came home from the war, her wagging tail and exuberant energy a stark contrast to his somber mood. But as James withdrew into himself, Sadie seemed to sense his pain. She would lay her head on his lap during his darkest moments, her presence a quiet comfort. When Rachel left, she took Sadie with her. James hadn't fought her decision. In truth, he believed Rachel had made the right choice. Sadie deserved better than the cold, detached man he had become. Now, as he walked through the snowy forest with this new dog and her puppies, memories of Sadie and Rachel tugged at his heart. He had lost so much, but perhaps this was a chance to give something back. By the time James reached his truck, the first light of dawn was breaking through the horizon. He opened the passenger door and gently placed the puppies on the seat, wrapping them in an old blanket he kept in the cab. The mother dog jumped in beside them, curling protectively around her babies. James climbed into the driver's seat, glancing over at the small family now occupying his truck. He let out a shaky breath, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "You need a name," he said, looking at the mother dog. Her eyes met his, calm yet resolute, and the name came to him in an instant. "Nora," he said softly. "It suits you. You're strong, and you've been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." Nora wagged her tail faintly, as if in approval. James started the engine and began the drive home, his mind already racing with what he needed to do. The puppies would need warmth, food, and care, things he hadn't provided for anyone in years. His house was a mess, but he would figure it out. This unexpected responsibility didn't feel like a burden. For the first time in what felt like forever, James felt something shift inside him, a spark of purpose, a flicker of hope. When they arrived at his small, cluttered house, James carefully carried the puppies inside, followed closely by Nora. He set up a makeshift bed for them in the corner of the living room, using old towels and blankets. Nora settled down with her pups, her body visibly relaxing for the first time since he had met her. James sat on the floor nearby, watching them. The sight of Nora tenderly licking her puppies brought a lump to his throat. This dog, despite her frailty, had done everything she could to keep her babies alive. Her resilience was humbling. As he watched them, James felt the weight of his own despair begin to lift, ever so slightly. He didn't know what the future held, but for now, he had a reason to keep moving forward. "Welcome home, Nora," he said quietly. James sat on the worn couch in his living room, a cup of lukewarm coffee cradled in his hands. Across the room, Nora lay on her makeshift bed, her 4 puppies snuggled tightly against her golden fur. The soft whimpers and squeaks of the puppies filled the air, a sound that was both soothing and strangely unfamiliar to James. The house, once cold and silent, now pulsed with life. Each day since bringing Nora and her pups home had been filled with purpose, feeding, cleaning, and ensuring they were warm and safe. Yet, as the days passed, something deeper began to stir in James. Caring for the dogs became a new kind of routine, one that forced James out of his own mind. Every morning, Nora greeted him with a wagging tail, and the puppies tumbled over one another, eager for his attention. Arlo, the largest and boldest of the litter, was always the first to approach, his little paws batting at James's hands. Milo, with his mischievous streak, loved to chew on James's shoelaces, much to his chagrin. Ellie, quiet and observant, often sat back, watching her siblings before joining in. And tiny Pippa, the runt of the litter, was a determined little fighter, always ready to wrestle her larger siblings despite her size. James found himself laughing more often than he had in years. The puppies' antics, toppling over each other, chasing their tails, or trying to climb onto furniture they were too small to reach, brought a warmth to his chest that he hadn't felt since before the war. But it wasn't just the puppies. Nora, with her calm strength and unwavering devotion to her babies, had a quiet resilience that James deeply admired. He often caught himself talking to her as if she could understand every word. "You're doing a good job, girl," he'd say, running a hand over her now shining coat. "Better than I ever could." Still, the nights remained difficult. When the house grew quiet and the puppies fell asleep, James often found himself staring at the ceiling, memories of Rachel creeping in alongside those of the war. He remembered the way Rachel used to sit beside him on the couch, her legs tucked under her, reading a book while Sadie, their old Labrador, rested at her feet. Rachel had a laugh that could fill a room, a warmth that had once melted the coldest parts of him, but he'd let her slip away, drowning in his own pain and shutting her out when she tried to help. Now, as he watched Nora curl protectively around her pups, he couldn't help but think of Rachel and Sadie. He wondered if Rachel had found happiness in the years since she left, if she had found someone who could give her the love and stability he hadn't been able to offer. That thought brought an ache to his chest, but it also pushed him to reflect. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for him to be better, not for Rachel, but for himself, and for the lives now depending on him. James began to make small changes around the house. The clutter that had accumulated over the years was slowly cleared away. He replaced the old, tattered blanket on the couch with one he'd bought specifically for Nora and her puppies. The air, once heavy with neglect, now felt lighter. Caring for the dogs brought a sense of structure to James's days. He found himself waking early to prepare their meals, taking Nora out for short walks while the puppies napped. These moments outdoors reminded him of how much he had once enjoyed the simple act of walking Sadie. One morning, as he watched the puppies play in the patch of sunlight streaming through the living room window, James realized something profound. For years, he had allowed his pain and regret to define him, but now these tiny creatures were teaching him to live in the moment. Arlo's adventurous spirit reminded James to be brave. Milo's mischievous antics brought him laughter. Ellie's quiet observation mirrored his own reflective nature, and Pippa's determined resilience inspired him to push forward. Nora, with her unwavering love for her pups, showed him the strength of unconditional care. The changes in James didn't go unnoticed by others. The elderly woman next door, who had rarely seen him leave his house before, remarked on how much healthier he looked. The cashier at the pet store, where James now frequented for supplies, noticed the small smile that crept onto his face when he talked about the dogs. But the most significant change was one James saw in himself. Slowly, the tight grip of PTSD began to loosen. The nightmares didn't disappear, but they became less frequent. The heavy weight on his chest didn't vanish, but it grew lighter. One evening, as James sat on the floor playing with the puppies, Nora approached him and rested her head on his lap. He looked down at her, his hand instinctively stroking her fur. "Thanks, girl," he said softly, "for everything." It wasn't just the dogs he was thanking. He was thanking the universe, or perhaps fate, for bringing them to him, for giving him a reason to fight again. That night, James sat at his kitchen table with a notebook and pen. For the first time in years, he began to write down his thoughts, not the horrors of war, but his hopes for the future. He wrote about the puppies, about how he wanted to ensure they found loving homes. He wrote about Nora, about how he couldn't imagine life without her calm presence. And he wrote about Rachel. He didn't know if he would ever see her again, but he wrote a letter to her in his mind. It wasn't an apology, though he knew he owed her one. Instead, it was a quiet acknowledgement of what they had shared and how much it had meant to him. When he put the pen down, James felt lighter. The road ahead wasn't clear, but it was no longer shrouded in darkness. The puppies were growing quickly. Their once fragile bodies had filled out with strength, their tiny paws now sturdy, and their playful personalities had begun to shine through. James watched them with a mix of pride and bittersweet joy, knowing the day would come when he would have to let them go. Each morning, the house seemed livelier than the last. Arlo, the bold adventurer, was always the first to explore new territory, nosing through every nook and cranny. Milo's mischievous streak had only grown, often stealing socks or dragging James's boots across the floor in a comical display of determination. Ellie, ever the gentle observer, would wait for the chaos to subside before stepping in, her calm demeanor offering balance. And Pippa, the smallest yet fiercest of them all, continued to prove her tenacity, holding her own in playful wrestling matches with her siblings. One evening, as James sat watching the puppies tumble over one another in a game of chase, he felt a pang in his chest. He knew he couldn't keep all of them, no matter how much he had grown attached. The house was too small, and his resources were limited. Most importantly, they deserved homes where they could receive undivided attention and love. James began planning. He took pictures of the puppies, capturing their unique personalities in each shot, and printed a small flyer. Loving puppies looking for forever homes, well-socialized, playful, and ready to bring joy to your life. For inquiries, please call James. He posted the flyers at the local pet store, the town's coffee shop, and even the library. While taping the last flyer to a bulletin board, a man in his late 30s approached him. "Are you the one with the golden retriever pups?" the man asked, a hopeful glint in his eye. James nodded. "Yeah, 4 of them, all full of energy." The man smiled. "My wife and I have been thinking about adopting a dog. We love hiking, and we're looking for an adventurous companion." James thought of Arlo immediately. "I think I have the perfect match for you," he said, a small smile creeping onto his face. The next day, the couple came to meet Arlo. The moment they walked into the living room, Arlo bounded up to them, wagging his tail with uncontainable enthusiasm. It was as if he knew they were his people. James watched as the man crouched down, letting Arlo sniff his hands before scratching behind his ears. The puppy responded with excited barks, his tail a blur of motion. "You're perfect," the woman said, laughing as Arlo licked her face. James knelt beside Arlo, gently patting his head. "Be good, buddy," he said, his voice steady but soft. "They'll take care of you." As the couple carried Arlo to their car, Nora let out a quiet whine, her eyes following her pup. James placed a comforting hand on her back. "He's going to be happy," he whispered, more to himself than to her. In the following weeks, more families came to meet the puppies. Milo was adopted by a young artist who immediately fell in love with his playful, chaotic energy. James couldn't help but laugh when Milo tugged on the woman's scarf as she tried to leave, clearly staking his claim. Ellie found her place with a retired librarian, a quiet woman who had lost her husband the year before. "I've been looking for a companion," she said softly, stroking Ellie's fur. "She has such a calming presence." James smiled, knowing Ellie would be perfect for her. With Arlo, Milo, and Ellie settled into their new homes, only Pippa remained. James had already decided early on that he couldn't part with her. She reminded him too much of himself, small, scrappy, and determined to survive no matter what life threw at her. Pippa's bond with Nora was undeniable. The little pup often curled up beside her mother, their golden fur blending together. But it was her connection with James that solidified his choice. She followed him everywhere, her tiny paws pattering behind him as he moved through the house. At night, she would nuzzle against his leg, her soft snores a comforting presence. "You're staying, kiddo," James said one evening, scratching her behind the ears. You and Nora are stuck with me now." Though letting go of the other puppies had been difficult, James found solace in the knowledge that they were all thriving in their new homes. Each adopter sent him updates, photos of Arlo bounding up hiking trails, Milo lounging in a sunny art studio, and Ellie curled up beside her new owner with a book. These glimpses into their happy lives reassured James that he had made the right decision. They were safe, loved, and living the lives they deserved. Still, the house felt quieter without them. Nora seemed to sense his melancholy, resting her head on his lap one evening as he sat on the couch. Pippa, as always, was close by, chewing on one of the toys James had bought for her. "You've done a good job, Nora," James said, running his hand over her fur. "They're going to be okay." With Nora and Pippa as his companions, James felt a sense of completeness he hadn't experienced in years. The house, though quieter, was still full of life. Pippa's playful energy and Nora's calming presence brought balance to his days. James had rediscovered something he thought he had lost forever, a sense of purpose. While the journey of finding homes for the puppies had been bittersweet, it had also reminded him of the power of love and connection. As he sat by the window watching Pippa chase a falling leaf in the yard, James smiled. "We're a family," he said softly, and for the first time in a long time he truly believed it. James stood in his small backyard, watching Pippa chase a butterfly while Nora lay nearby, her golden coat shining under the midday sun. The peace of this moment was a stark contrast to the man he had been just months ago, broken, isolated, and on the brink of giving up. Nora and her puppies hadn't just given him companionship, they had opened his eyes to the transformative power of love and second chances. The journey of caring for Nora and her pups had planted a seed in James. He realized he wasn't the only one who had faced despair, nor was he the only one who could use a second chance. What began as a faint idea started to take shape as he reflected on his own struggles and the countless animals and people in his community who needed help. One afternoon, while walking Nora and Pippa through the park, James noticed a man sitting on a bench, staring blankly at the horizon. His posture was familiar, shoulders hunched, head down, as if the weight of the world was pressing him into the earth. James hesitated but eventually approached. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" he said, trying to strike up a conversation. The man looked up, startled. He glanced at Nora and Pippa, who wagged their tails warmly, and a faint smile crossed his face. "Yeah," he said. "It is." They talked for a while. The man, Brian, was a fellow veteran who had recently lost his wife. He admitted that he felt lost, unsure of how to move forward. James listened, nodding as Brian described feelings he knew all too well. Before they parted, James said, "You ever thought about adopting a dog? They won't solve everything, but they'll remind you that you're not alone." Brian chuckled softly. "Maybe. I'll think about it." That interaction lingered in James's mind long after he returned home. It was then that he realized his experience with Nora and her puppies wasn't just a personal journey, it was a bridge, a way to connect with others who were struggling. With a renewed sense of purpose, James began laying the groundwork for what would become Golden Paws Haven. His idea was simple but powerful. Create a space where stray and abandoned dogs could find safety and love, and where veterans or others in need of healing could connect with these animals. James reached out to local shelters, explaining his vision. Many were supportive, offering resources and guidance. He converted his backyard into a temporary haven, building sturdy enclosures and play areas for the dogs. The house, once cluttered and neglected, was now organized and filled with supplies, dog food, toys, blankets, and medical kits. The first dog he rescued was a scrappy beagle mix he named Scout. Scout had been found wandering the streets, limping from an old injury. With patience and care, James nursed him back to health. When Scout was ready, James introduced him to Brian, the veteran he had met in the park. Brian's eyes lit up as Scout licked his hand, his tail wagging furiously. "You're right," Brian said, smiling for the first time in months. "This little guy might be exactly what I need." Watching Brian and Scout bond cemented James's belief in his mission. Golden Paws Haven quickly grew beyond James's backyard. Word spread through the town about his work, and volunteers began to show up, offering time, donations, and even foster homes for the dogs. Local businesses pitched in, with a pet supply store donating food and toys, and a contractor offering to build a proper shelter. James also started organizing monthly events where veterans could come and meet the dogs. These gatherings became a space not only for potential adoptions, but also for connection and healing. Veterans shared their stories with one another, forming friendships that extended beyond the walls of the shelter. Through it all, Nora remained at James's side, a constant reminder of why he had started this journey. Her calm presence was a source of comfort, not just for him, but for everyone who visited Golden Paws Haven. One day, a young girl named Lily came with her family to adopt a dog. She had been shy and withdrawn, recovering from the loss of her older brother, a soldier. While the rest of her family looked at the other dogs, Lily sat quietly in the corner, hugging her knees. Nora approached her slowly, lowering her head to nuzzle the girl's hand. Lily's face softened, and she began to pet Nora's fur. For the first time in weeks, her parents said, Lily smiled. "That's the magic of Nora," James told them, his voice filled with pride. As Golden Paws Haven thrived, so did James. The man who had once struggled to get out of bed each morning now woke with purpose. His days were filled with activity, rescuing dogs, training them, matching them with the right homes, and mentoring other veterans. One evening, as James sat on the porch with Nora and Pippa, he reflected on how far he had come. The despair that had once consumed him felt like a distant memory. He still carried the scars of his past, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they had become a part of his story, a story of resilience, connection, and hope. Golden Paws. Haven became more than just a shelter, it became a community. Through James's work, dozens of dogs found loving homes, and countless people, veterans, families, and individuals, found healing through their connection with the animals. James often thought about Rachel during quiet moments. While he didn't know if he'd ever see her again, he felt that she would be proud of the man he had become. As he watched Nora and Pippa play in the yard, James smiled. The journey that had begun with despair on a bridge had brought him here, a place of hope, surrounded by love. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the park. James stood near a large oak tree, watching as Nora and Pippa bounded toward the open field where familiar figures were gathering. The wagging tails and joyful barks of fully grown dogs echoed through the crisp air as they greeted one another. These reunions had become a cherished tradition for James. Twice a year, the families who had adopted Nora's puppies brought them together to celebrate their shared journey. The sight of Arlo, Milo, Ellie, and Pippa, now strong, vibrant dogs, never failed to fill James with pride and gratitude. Families and friends gathered on picnic blankets, chatting and laughing as the dogs played. Arlo, true to his adventurous spirit, was darting through an obstacle course set up by his family. Milo, ever the mischief maker, had claimed a frisbee and was refusing to let it go. Ellie lay calmly beside her elderly owner, soaking in the sun, while Pippa darted around the park, ensuring she missed none of the action. James looked at Nora, who sat regally by his side, watching her offspring with a mix of calm and pride. He knelt down and scratched behind her ears. "You did good, girl," he said softly. "Look at them. Look at what we built together." Nora licked his hand, her tail thumping against the ground. As James mingled with the families, sharing stories of the dog's antics and progress, a familiar voice behind him sent a chill down his spine. "James?" He turned slowly, his heart skipping a beat. There she was, Rachel. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight, and her green eyes, once filled with sorrow, now held a glimmer of warmth. James blinked, unsure if he was dreaming. "Rachel?" She smiled a little nervously. "Hi." They stood there for a moment, the noise of the park fading into the background. Then Rachel stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly. "I heard about what you've been doing. Golden Paws Haven, the dogs, everything. I had to see it for myself." James's voice was thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd see you again." Rachel glanced at the field where the dogs were playing, then back at James. "You've changed," she said softly. James nodded. "I had to." He gestured toward Nora, who was now sitting quietly watching them. "They changed me." Rachel and James found a quiet spot under the oak tree, away from the crowd. As the golden light of the setting sun bathed the park, they talked about the years they had spent apart, about the pain that had driven them away from each other, and about the journey that had brought them back together. Rachel shared how difficult it had been to leave, how much she had hoped James would find his way. "I prayed for you every day," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I asked God to give you strength, to help you find peace." James swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I think he did," he said quietly, "in his own way. He sent me Nora." Rachel smiled, glancing at the loyal dog lying at their feet. "And through her, you found your purpose." James nodded. "And now somehow you're here." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Maybe that's his plan too. As the evening wore on, Rachel stayed by James's side, meeting the families and the dogs who had become such a vital part of his life. She marveled at the joy and connection that radiated through the park, a stark contrast to the darkness that had once consumed James. By the time the reunion ended, Rachel had bonded with Pippa, who seemed to take an instant liking to her. James couldn't help but laugh as the tiny dog climbed onto Rachel's lap, wagging her tail furiously. "She's a keeper," Rachel said, scratching behind Pippa's ears. "So are you," James replied, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Over the following weeks, Rachel became a regular presence at Golden Paws Haven. She joined James in caring for the dogs, her natural compassion and warmth a perfect complement to his newfound strength and purpose. Together they expanded the shelter, welcoming more animals and connecting more veterans with companions. Their relationship, once fractured, began to heal. They prayed together each night, thanking God for the second chance they had been given. James often reflected on how miraculous it was, how Nora's arrival had set off a chain of events that led him to this moment. One sunny afternoon, as James watched Rachel throw a ball for Pippa in the backyard, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Nora lay beside him, her head resting on his knee, while Pippa darted around the yard like a whirlwind. "God works in mysterious ways, doesn't he?" Rachel said, sitting down beside James. He nodded, placing his hand over hers. "He brought me back from the edge, gave me Nora and the puppies, and somehow he brought you back too." Rachel smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And now we've got a second chance." James looked out at the yard, at the dogs who had given him so much, and at Rachel, who had never stopped believing in him. For the first time in years, he felt whole. "Yeah," he said softly, "we do." The crisp morning air carried the scent of pine and frost as James walked along the familiar path toward the bridge. This time his steps were steady, his head held high, and his heart light. Beside him, Nora trotted gracefully, her golden coat gleaming in the soft sunlight. Pippa, ever energetic, darted ahead, sniffing at the bushes and bouncing back to James as if to urge him to keep up. And just a step behind, Rachel walked quietly, her presence a grounding comfort. Her hand brushed against James's as they moved together in an unspoken rhythm, a connection that had once been broken but was now stronger than ever. When the bridge came into view, James paused, The last time he stood there, he had been a man teetering on the edge, both literally and metaphorically. The memory of that night was still vivid, the biting cold, the swirling waters below, and the desperate emptiness that had gripped his soul. But then Nora had appeared, a small yet powerful light in his darkness, leading him to a new path. Now, standing at the same spot, James felt no trace of despair. Instead, he was filled with a profound sense of gratitude, not just for Nora and Pippa, but for the unexpected journey that had brought him here. Rachel placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle yet firm. "It's different now, isn't it?" she said, her voice soft. James nodded, his gaze fixed on the water below. "I came here to give up," he said, his voice steady, "but instead I found a reason to keep going." He turned to Nora, who sat by his side, her warm brown eyes watching him intently. He knelt down and stroked her fur, his voice breaking slightly. "You saved me that night, girl. You didn't just save my life, you gave me a new one." James stood and took Rachel's hand, his fingers interlocking with hers. "I didn't believe in miracles back then," he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of old pain. "But now, I think I've seen one." Rachel smiled, her eyes misty. "God works in ways we can't always see. Sometimes it's through people, sometimes it's through a dog." James chuckled softly, glancing at Nora. "Or two." As they stood there, James reflected on how far he had come. Nora had been his first miracle, but every step since had been guided by small, almost imperceptible blessings. The families who adopted her puppies, the veterans who found healing at Golden Paws Haven, the community that rallied around his mission, all of it felt like a divine hand steering him towards something greater. Pippa barked excitedly, breaking the moment of quiet reflection. She had found a stick and was wagging her tail furiously, urging James to play. He laughed and obliged, throwing the stick far down the path. Pippa dashed after it, her boundless energy a reminder of life's simple joys. Rachel watched the scene with a smile. "She's a lot like you," she said. "How's that?" James asked, turning to her. "Determined," Rachel replied, "resilient, and maybe just a little stubborn." James laughed, his heart swelling with love for the woman who had found her way back to him. As they began their walk back across the bridge, James felt a sense of closure. The place that had once represented the end of his story now marked the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope, love, and purpose. Before leaving, he paused in the middle of the bridge and took a deep breath. "This place used to haunt me," he said, looking at Rachel and then at Nora and Pippa. "Now it feels like a reminder that even when everything seems lost, there's still a way forward." Rachel stepped closer, her hand resting on his arm. "And sometimes it's the smallest things that lead us there," she said. James nodded, his gaze sweeping over the landscape. "Like a dog showing up on a bridge," he said with a smile. As they walked back toward the trail, James felt a profound sense of peace. Nora walked beside him, her tail wagging gently, while Pippa darted around, her joy infectious. Rachel, her presence warm and steady, intertwined her fingers with his. James didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't be facing it alone. He had found a family, not just in Rachel, Nora, and Pippa, but in the community he had built through Golden Paws Haven. The journey that began on the edge of despair had come full circle, transforming into a story of hope, love, and the power of small, meaningful acts. And as the sun rose higher, casting its light across the bridge and the path ahead, James felt ready to embrace whatever lay ahead, one step at a time.